Hello, everybody. I hope you are having a fantastic day. It's nice and warm here today. Got up to, I think, probably like 95 degrees. However, it is a chilly 65 degrees in my basement, which is why I have got a sweatshirt on. So we're just going to dive right into it. I know last video was plagues of Egypt, so we're going to finish up with the last plague here, the death of the firstborns. So why don't you go ahead and read Exodus chapter 11, verses 4 through 10, and then come on right back. All right, so you can see that was just a description of the plague that Moses and Aaron are giving to Pharaoh to kind of tell him, like, hey, if you don't let us go, this is what's going to happen.
I said, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh baby, let my people go.
And then Pharaoh does not let them go. So now we're going to move ahead to Exodus chapter 12, verses 29 through 36. All right, so this is the actual description of the plague as it happens. And then Pharaoh telling Aaron and Moses, like, okay, time to leave. Go ahead and get out of here. And you can see that they actually kind of like ransack the Egyptians as they leave. They take the gold and like more animals and everything. I want to actually draw your attention to verse 32. So it's take your flocks too and your herds, as you said, and go and bless me too. That's what Pharaoh says. And now I want to go to the footnote on this. I just thought this was interesting. So the footnote on bless me too. In a final and humiliated admission of defeat, once again, Pharaoh asks Moses to intercede for him. However, Pharaoh may be speaking sarcastically. I just think that's funny because, I don't know, sarcasm is apparently very old. Just keep that in mind. All right, so this plague kind of allows us the ability to ask the really big question, which is, like, why would God do that? The other plagues are kind of symbolic and not super destructive, at least towards human life. And then this one is just the absolute death of all of the firstborns, which is horrifying. So it leaves us wondering, like, well, how can a good and merciful God, be this destructive? And trust me, I don't have all the answers. I'd love to ask him that if I end up there someday, hopefully. But kind of what me and Jared were talking about is that if you really think about it, is that we don't really deserve anything from God. It sounds kind of harsh, but it's true. So our life each day is a gift. And so additionally, the Father, God, is doing what he must to protect his children, which is what any father would do. And in this case, his children are the Israelites. Additionally, this is a response to Egypt killing all of the firstborns way back before Moses. So that's why, like, Moses ended up in the river. And also it's foreshadowing for Herod killing all the firstborns when he hears about Jesus. Also, on that same line, God never does anything to us that he wouldn't do to himself. So we can see this in that God sacrifices himself on the cross in the form of Jesus. That's, his firstborn kid. So it's kind of nice and comforting in a little way to know that. Cool. So moving on, the Passover feast, like, this kind of is the origins of that. I'm woefully inept to talk about that, so we're just going to kind of admit that it's here, admit that I'm inept to talk about it, and then move on. Just know that it exists here. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about is, how does this last plague kind of fit with what we've been talking about, in that, like, how is it an apocalypse? It's pretty clear how it's terrible for the Egyptians. All of their firstborns die and they're ransacked, and all of their slaves are set free. Not great. But, how is this bad for Israel? They are freed from slavery. They get all of this gold. That sounds like a pretty good deal. Now, why don't you go ahead and read Numbers chapter 14, verses 1 through 3. So here we get to see it's not all peaches for the Israelites. They are in the wilderness for 40 years. And this is kind of like immediately after they leave Egypt, and they're already complaining about how they're dying to enemies and just like sickness and hunger, and they're like, dope, let's go back to Egypt. We don't want to be here anymore. So they're ready to sacrifice their freedom for like a supposed life, even though it's a life of slavery, which is, it's kind of disheartening because, I mean, us as the reader knows that the ultimate goal and the good is to move past the life of slavery, to get out of the wilderness and enter into the promised land, and that's where they're going. It's just taking them a while to get there, and it's hard on them. And their reaction multiple times through Numbers and in Exodus is to complain to Moses and then say, let's just go back to Egypt. And every time they end up not going back, thankfully. But it's not super great. It's not like they're out of Egypt and then it's just ultimately good. There is a sense of trial that they have to go through, which is ultimately like a good thing. Israel is better off as a people for braving and completing the trial in the wilderness. And we see this again echoed with Jesus and spending 40 days in the desert. He's tempted by the devil and ultimately, succeeds above those temptations. Okay, the crazy thing is we see this in our own lives. I mean, how many times are you in a place where it's not great and you want to get out, and whatever it is, but it requires a change. Like, you have to do something different with your life, and you're like a little bit into this new lifestyle and it's terrible, you hate it, and you want to just go back to whatever it was before, even though it's bad. It's something familiar, so it feels comforting. But in actuality, if you would just stick with your new lifestyle or whatever it is that you chose, and you eventually overcome it, you end up in a much better place and grow as a person. And we see this a lot with sin, right? Because, you're living in a life of sin, whatever it is. And then if you want to change that sin, if it's become a habit, like, it's difficult. You have to go through that wilderness of getting over it and figuring out how to, resist those temptations. But then eventually, you end up in this amazing place, and you can look back and say, wow, I'm much better off where I am now than where I was. And I'm so glad that I persevered through this. So that brings us to the end of this video. Once again, I highly suggest going and checking out the PDF that is down below in the description. There are some really good discussion questions that kind of fit with the theme of this. And, I hope you guys enjoy this. We'll see you in the next one.